Thank you. Thank you. So this is Magna Carta, the first example of an English king, King John, accepting limits on his power imposed by his subjects. Can anyone guess the age of the medieval charter? How old is this document? Just call it some numbers. 1215. So yes, 800 years old. The document is celebrating its 800th anniversary this year. And I've had the pleasure of spending a very long time analyzing this document, writing the book, Magna Carta and Its Gifts to Canada, which will be accompanying the Magna Carta Canada exhibition, which is touring Canada this year. For those of us in Toronto, it's coming to Fort York in October and November, so you'll be able to see Magna Carta for yourself. Now, there aren't many 800-year-old documents that we're still talking about today, but this document serves as the foundation of the constitutional monarchy. As the centuries passed, more and more limits were imposed on the power of kings and queens, and also the foundation of the English common law system. If you go down the various clauses of Magna Carta in 1215, all the way down to 39 and 40, there are guarantees to trial by jury, freedom from arbitrary rule, a degree of due process, and that justice will not be delayed or denied. Now, one thing that's helped Magna Carta maintain its resonance over the centuries is that it's inspired so many artists and musicians and writers. This is one of the few times I get to talk about Rudyard Kipling, the author of the Jungle Book, and Jay-Z in the same lecture. But what do Rudyard Kipling and Jay-Z have in common? They're both fans of Magna Carta. Rudyard Kipling wrote What Say the Reeds at Runnymede 100 years ago to commemorate the 700th anniversary of Magna Carta. And Runnymede, of course, is a reference to Runnymede Meadow, where King John reluctantly affixed his seal to the document in 1215. This was neutral ground near Windsor Castle, where King John and his barons could meet and discuss the terms of the document. So it's a very long poem, so I'm not going to do the full reading. But one of the key verses is, at Runnymede, your rights were won at Runnymede. No free man shall be fined or bound or dispossessed of freehold ground, except by lawful judgment found and passed upon him by his peers. Forget not, after all these years, the charter signed at Runnymede. And it certainly has not been forgotten. On the left, you have the cover art of Jay-Z's album, Magna Carta, Holy Grail, as Jay-Z, too, is inspired by the idea of Magna Carta guaranteeing freedom and liberties. And Salisbury Cathedral in England actually displayed the cover art next to one of the surviving versions of Magna Carta in the cathedral museums. We see the cover art on the left, and on the right is a statue of John accepting Magna Carta. So Salisbury Cathedral had a whole bunch of new visitors who hadn't visited before, seeing the cover art as well as Magna Carta. So this document has a cultural resonance as well as a political and legal resonance that's lasted throughout the years. Now, this is a 19th century drawing of King John reluctantly accepting Magna Carta. He's not sucking his thumb as John did in Disney's Robin Hood, but he's not happy to be here, that this is happening to him. Now, we're going to play one of my favorite games, Spot the Historical Inaccuracy. Can anyone see something wrong with this image? Is there something inaccurate that's happening here? Yes? Yes, we see in that's perfect. We see in this image, King John has a quill and is signing his name, when in fact King John affixed the royal seal to Magna Carta. A royal seal is a lot harder to forge than a signature, so it was in fact a seal rather than a signature. And that was also important, as whereas King John had grown up at Fontevraud Abbey and was quite well read and learned, there were previous monarchs who weren't entirely literate, who spent more time fighting battles than reading. So a royal seal was also a way, if the monarch didn't know how to read and write, they could still get their will forward. So it was in fact the seal that was used. Another interesting aspect of this image is that there are no women portrayed at all. We have John, we have some rebel barons who've absolutely had it with his arbitrary rule and mistreatment of them. We have clergymen, but we don't see any women in this image. And that raises the question, is this another historical inaccuracy? Should there be women here at Runnymede Meadow at this time? And it's a complicated answer to that, because there were not, in fact, women present drafting the document, imposing it on King John. But as we will discuss, the document guaranteed certain rights for women 800 years ago and set precedents for today. So this is King John's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and his father, King Henry II. These are their funerary monuments in Fontevraud Abbey, which is worth a visit if you're ever in France's Loire Valley. It's a really beautiful place between Chinon and Saumur. Lots of wineries around there as well. So it's a very nice part of the world. And Eleanor of Aquitaine, King John's mother, was one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. As Duchess of Aquitaine, she controlled a quarter of what is now France. She had an independent income and cultural patronage. She was a patron of troubadours and authors. And she even stepped in the political disputes of the era. She backed a rebellion by her older sons against her husband, Henry II. Eleanor favored the older son, Richard the Lionheart, whereas Henry favored the younger son, John. And these family conflicts became wider political conflicts. So when Henry II dies, 1189, and the older son, Richard, comes to the throne, Eleanor of Aquitaine becomes one of the most powerful women in England, acts, in a sense, as Richard's regent when he's away on the Third Crusade. And she's a key power broker after Richard dies, childless, in 1199, and John succeeds to the throne. So a very powerful woman. But the royal women of the next generation were not able to exert nearly as much political power. King John married 12-year-old Isabella of Angoulême, who was a great heiress, but he kept her on a very tight budget. Traditionally, queens had their own incomes and were able to, therefore, exert political patronage, cultural patronage. But John imposed the taxes known as Queen's Gold and kept that money for himself rather than passing it along to his wife. And there's visual manifestations of this, that King John's reign is the era of really flamboyant menswear because he spent lavishly on himself, so the other noblemen imitated the brocade mantles, the colored hose with gold cross garters, whereas the queen, who was being kept on a very tight allowance, dressed quite simply. So the men of the court are all dressed very flamboyantly, and their wives are dressed much more simply in imitation of the king and queen. So it was so even on a purely visual level, let alone the political patronage, the artistic patronage, there was a huge contrast between the powerful Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter-in-law Isabella of Angoulême, who was kept in the background to such a wide degree. And Isabella's treatment was part of a wider trend in which King John tended to simply dismiss the rights of noble women under the traditional English customs of the land. And one of those was that when a noble woman was widowed, she expected to have the freedom to choose her second husband. Now, King John violated that. He had a very expensive war with France throughout much of his reign. And so one of the ways in which he raised money to pay for his wars was to auction off the right to marry noble widows. This was a great way for wealthy London merchants to buy their way into the nobility. And the nobles were horrified by this, as you're supposed to marry within your social class. So some wealthy wine merchant, providing the king with a large bag of gold and then expecting to marry a noble widow, went against the social conventions of the time. So even though it was noble men, clergymen who drafted Magna Carta and imposed it on King John, they acknowledged the rights of noble widows. So here's clause number 7, and this is much higher than clauses 39, 40, which talk about trial by jury and the justice shall not be delayed or denied. At her husband's death, a widow may have her marriage portion and inheritance at once and without trouble. She shall pay nothing for her dower, marriage portion, or any inheritance that she and her husband held jointly on the day of his death. She may remain in her husband's house for 40 days after his death, and within this period her dower shall be assigned to her. So noble women are to have the financial independence they were widowed, and this is very much in the interest of noble men. All that ongoing warfare meant that it was very possible that a nobleman or a baron might die on the battlefield or of disease waiting to go into battle, and wanted to ensure his family was looked after. So the next clause, no widow shall be compelled to marry so long as she wishes to remain without a husband, but she must give security she will not marry without royal consent if she holds her lands of the crown, or without the consent from whatever other lord she may hold them of. So here is freedom from forced remarriage. And once again, this demonstrates how what we sometimes think of as women's rights at this time were thought of as the rights of an entire social class or of society as a whole. For these noble men who were risking their lives in the king's various wars, they were concerned that if they died, their wives might be compelled to remarry, and then the second husband might spend the whole inheritance before the children from the first marriage were old enough to grow up and inherit. So what was at stake here was not simply women's autonomy and freedom, but the wider sense of social stability and inheritance rights and families at the time. Now, this document was extremely powerful in 1215, helped inspire the growth of Parliament over the course of the 13th century. But then the Charter has a period of comparative decline in Tudor times, when it was thought that a strong monarch like Henry VIII or Elizabeth I was necessary to protect England from invasions of the Spanish Armada of 1588, for instance. So those of you who perhaps went to the Stratford Festival last year and saw Shakespeare's play King John, you'll notice there's something missing. There's not a single mention of Magna Carta over the course of the play. We see the barons preparing to revolt, they rebel, and then King John dies, and you're thinking something really important is missing there. It seems like writing a play about John A. Macdonald and leaving out Confederation, that there's something really key that's missing. But in Shakespeare's time, Magna Carta had become an obscure legal document consulted by lawyers, and it was thought to be important that the monarch be powerful and able to make decisions without outside interference. Now, Magna Carta has its revival then in the next century. In the 17th century, the jurist Sir Edward Coke wrote that Magna Carta was not some obscure text, but the cornerstone of English laws and liberties. And everyone listened to Sir Edward Coke because he was the one writing the law textbooks, the institutes of English laws that were studied throughout the English-speaking world. These textbooks were printed in the 13 colonies, where Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were reading them. So Coke's interpretation of Magna Carta as a seminal document informs the American Revolution, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen during the French Revolution, Canada's Confederation, and the way we view the document today and why we are still talking about all these years later. And so this interpretation of Magna Carta as this key seminal document informs the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here's American First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt unfurling one of the versions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She chaired the committee that looked at which rights should be held by people, whatever their culture, wherever they live in the world. And the issue of freedom from forced marriage arose here as well. So from the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, men and women of full age without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion have the right to marry and found a family. They're entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage, and at its dissolution. And marriage shall be entered into only with the free and full consent of the intending spouses, and the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. Now, even in 1948, all these centuries after Magna Carta, these clauses were still controversial. Saudi Arabia, for instance, refused to ratify this document, arguing that it was against Sharia law, the marriage rights being provided. Pakistan, another Islamic nation, though, did sign on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, disputing that there was any conflict between this and Sharia law. So the debate raged on centuries after Magna Carta had first codified the issue, and the issue continues to be live today. Sadly, there are parts of the world where it's not so different from King John's time. John was able to marry a 12-year-old, and that there are parts of the world where being full age and entering into marriage with the free consent of both spouses remains an ideal. But the fact that the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights codifies this as a universal right, it demonstrates that 800 years after Magna Carta, this medieval charter is still casting a very long influence, and we're still talking about this today as women's rights are in fact human rights and the rights of all of society. So I encourage everyone to go and see the Magna Carta when it comes to Toronto in the fall, and be part of this wider conversation about human rights as it's unfolded over the past 800 years. Thank you.